main topic time.
Yes, here we go.
So, baddies we want to bring back. This, I think, Rob, came from the fact that we've taken Doctor Who classic teams and put them into new stories, and new Who teams and put them into old stories. We've taken Doctor Who teams and put them into television, Doctor Who and put them into the movies. Now we're taking Doctor Who and putting it back into Doctor Who. Which seems it seems a logical apotheosis of this genre of mixing and matching. But look, in all seriousness, there are a large number of baddies described however you want. Monsters, villains, wicked, nasty people, slightly off people, that we think we'd like to bring back. It's a topic that often comes up in Doctor Who. I think not a month goes by on Doctor Who Twitter where someone doesn't say, who's the monster you most want them to bring back next season?
Yeah.
And so we're riffing on that. Now, Rob, as I put my list together, I sort of found that these were bunching up into a few similar categories. So maybe I will sort of bounce us through the groups that I've got, see if you've got things that fit into that or not, and then if you've got something else at the end, we can go on with that.
Can I know them up front? Like, what are they? What are your categories?
Sure, okay. My categories are better SFX, story-based, prequels, planets, and people.
Right.
Look, Rob, I've sprung these categories on you. So, to be fair, which one would you like to start with?
Well, hold that thought, Dave. I want to say one thing before we begin, too.
Please.
Because I want to say before we begin that I think there are, well, actually I know there are, going to be examples of baddies here that have probably already come back in things like Big Finish or BBC audios or short stories or whatever. And I don't want to get bogged down in that. I'm not sure about you, Dave. I want this to come across as how the average Who fan sees and thinks about this stuff on telly. And I reckon the average Who fan doesn't listen to Big Finish and things like that. I mean, good grief, less than 20,000 people buy Doctor Who magazine. It's the hardcore part of fandom that I think does this stuff is really small. So, yeah, if I say something in my bits and they were in an audio or a short story and they've already come back in that sense, I might already know that. Or I might not know it, and I just don't care. This is all about stuff coming back to TV for mine. What about you, Dave?
Yeah, look, there might be a couple of times I will reference something because I am aware and it sort of has fed my interest. But if that's not particularly relevant, then no. And look, I certainly don't know an exhaustive list of exhaustive of Big Finish stories that have come out and what's been featured in them. So yeah, I think I will generally not know most of them.
Very good. Well, that was just my little spiel for the start. I'm good to go.
Well, which category should we dive into, Rob?
I would like planets for 10 points, Dave.
It's very game show. Planets for 10 points. So there were a couple of examples where I thought it's less about me wanting to bring back the villain or the monster so much as me wanting to use that to bring back a world. And I think that's an interesting way to get into this. So the two planets I had, and I'll go into each in a bit more detail in a moment, are Vortis and Caldor City. Mm-hmm. Now, Vortis is, of course, from the Web Planet and would, of course, mean bringing back the Zabi, the Menoptera, the Larvae Gums, and I think that would be a really interesting thing to do. But I also think it would be really interesting to go back to Vortis and see this planet as it is 100 years later or 50 years later, after the Doctors cleared away the Animus and allowed the forests to grow back, allowed nature to sort of revolve or re-evolve, and then to see how they would do the Menoptera and the Zabi and all the creatures that go into there, the Optera as well. Because, it is famously that Doctor Who story where nobody appears as a humanoid other than the regular TARDIS crew. Mm-hmm. And I think that's worth revisiting. And of course, look, Caldor City, why wouldn't you bring back the Robots of Death?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. A no-brainer there.
Yeah, you've got a whole society. So, we've done the robots looking very cool and sinister on a sand mine. Let's do them back in Caldor City.
Yeah, no, that's very, very good. I have my list of my main picks. I also have some special mentions where I have less to say about them. I think one of my special mentions ties in here, and that's the Chameleons. because
wow.
yeah, I think there's a lot you can do with a shape-shifting species in general, and it would seem a no-brainer to do something again with these guys from the faceless ones. And I'm going to tie it into your planet idea here, because obviously they're the result of something going fantastically bad on their planet. So I'm just riffing now. I don't know whether you do something before that happened on their planet, or whether it's just set on their planet, and we just explore more of that side of things, rather than, kidnapping teenagers on package holidays in the 60s.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one, because obviously there's a lot more you could do now with that, with present-day production values. But also, famously enough, I think we brought this up when we talked about the DVD release. It is that story where the Doctor, having foiled the villain, says, "Oh, look, maybe I could possibly, perhaps if I get bored, think of some way to kind of help you. Actually, no, I'm just going to bugger off. You're on your own now. Sorry I foiled your plan, but you're stuck as whatever it is they're stuck as."
Yeah.
And the idea that they'll go, "Well, hang on. We're just meant to sit here now."
Yes.
What would be their next plan? Or you're right. What do they do? Do they take people back to their home planet? I don't know, but yeah, there's a lot of potential for the chameleons.
And a second one here, and this was one of my main picks. I'll throw this into planets, and that's the Sycorax. Because I'm genuinely surprised these guys, are confined to a Christmas special, because they've got the whole voodoo blood magic thing going on, which is fascinating, because they're also really high tech as well. I think if someone sat down and really fleshed these guys out, they could make for a really interesting story. Because at the present, it's all surface stuff that we know. The look of them, the blood magic. They've got those whips that disintegrate people. They've got that bloody big spaceship, and then Harriet Jones says bugger off and blows them up. They're a kind of villain that just fulfilled what needed to happen in that story, and then they were shuffled off. But I think if we flesh them out, if we land on their planet, and we're on this planet with these voodoo blood magic dudes, that could be a really interesting story to flesh out, I think.
I was going to politely disagree with you for a bit there, Rob, and then you actually took my rebuttal point, and owned it.
Oh, did I?
You did, because when you put it to me a moment ago, that would be cool. Then I thought, actually, there's really nothing to the Sycorax. They're very, very shallow. They're very one-dimensional. And look, I guess the point you're making is, could they be fleshed out? And the question I'm asking is, could they be fleshed out? And it might be one of those ones where you sit down and go, actually, yeah, there's this whole backstory of the civilization and the way it sort of works that we can kind of go into, and that would be really interesting. Or it might be one where you sort of sit there for 2 minutes and go, no, these guys actually don't work as a society. And it sort of reminds me a little bit of the Klingons in Star Trek, where when you actually stop and think about it for a moment, you go, how does this society function?
Yes.
Everybody's a warrior. Everybody's killing each other to be promoted. It's all about honor and ceremony. And who actually goes and makes sure that the water turns on? Who actually keeps the power on? Who builds the spaceships? Who sells birthday cakes? I don't know. How does Klingon society function? And I kind of wonder if the Sycorax is going to be a bit like that when you look below the surface and go, no. But maybe there's
that's the challenge.
That's the challenge. Yeah. As I said, you took my rebuttal and you owned it.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah, so that's very cool. I might pick the next category.
Sure.
And this was an obvious starting point for me, I think, when I was putting my mind towards what we might do with these categories, and that is the better special effects category. So I was looking at a monster that I particularly want to bring back because I want to see it done with 2020's production values, where I think the concept is interesting or good, but just ridiculously let down by the budget of the time. And the two that I've come up with are the Wirrn and the Vardant.
Okay.
Now, the Wirrn were an excellent monster. They are terrifying. They are creepy. There is, I think, nothing scarier in Doctor Who than possession. And that idea of being infected by the Wirrn, being turned into the Wirrn, I mean, it is some of the most horrific stuff that Doctor Who has ever did.
Oh, yeah.
And I mean, that hard cut that Hinchcliffe had to make in episode 3, where it's it's not even subtle. It's very clear that things are getting a bit nasty. Cut, suddenly the scene's over. You go, oh, what happened there?
Yeah.
That is about as nasty as Who got. So they are a very effective concept. And the idea of them being sort of wiped out by man as man was exploring the galaxy does have very Starship Troopers vibes to it.
Yeah, it does. It really does.
Yeah, it really does. This idea of, there's this planet of bugs that are just sort of doing their own thing and they've got their nest and all the rest of that, and humanity comes along and says, I'm sorry, get out of the way, we need to build a car park there. And suddenly it's on for young and old. That's a really good question, but, you could do the Wirrn as CGI creatures really, really well now. Now, I'll get to my second one, but did you have any to drop in here, Rob?
Oh, I certainly do, Dave. And the first one is going to be a throwback to earlier in the episode, and that's Raxacoricophalopatorians.
Oh.
And I know what some people out there might be saying, like, oh, Rob, what a safe guess now that RTD's probably bringing them back. But no, in all honesty, I've had a bit of a turnaround on these guys for a few years now. Basically, in the Eccleston era, they were a bit jokey, all the overacting, the farting, the general look of things, and especially the CG version didn't shout to me, this is a great villain, let's bring him back sometime. And I don't think that's unfair to say, because how often have they been brought back? They might have been in the background of that Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe rip-off scene where Smithy's being dragged to the Pandorica and all the aliens are lined up watching him being dragged into it. But aside from that, they haven't come back in their own show or anything like that, their own story. So I read a couple of years ago a novel called The Monsters Inside. It's an NSA novel, a new series adventure novel. It's an Eccleston story. And I thought, holy crap, these guys are scary AF. I won't be spoilerific for such an old book, but I'll say it's really violent and graphic, and while that might not be everyone's cup of tea, when you're dealing with things that make skin suits out of people, essentially, that's a pretty horrifying thing, and I think it needs to be part of the story. These things just eviscerate you, Dave, and I think if you brought them back and just leaned a little more into the horror of that and made them scary rather than farting and, oh, let's unzip my forehead and have a bit of a giggle types, I think they could be a really, really strong villain. And I'm tying it into your better special effects, because one of the problems with the Raxacoricophalopatorians, or the Slovene as most people call them, even though that's just one family, was the CG version. The man in the suit version was okay, but the CG version looked very ropey back in 2005. I think they could look a lot better today.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I'm going to agree and disagree with you a little bit. I think that you're right. They're ripe for exploring. And you made the point. The Slovene that we've seen are simply one family. And what we haven't seen is the rest of the society in Raxacoricophalopatorius. So that actually, I think, is a really good entry into going, are these other Slovene or their neighbours darker, lighter, different? How does that all work? And Rob, you talked about how you could make them a really dark and effective villain on their return. But where I was thinking was very Sarah Jane Adventures, and saying, if one of the jobs that RTD has over the next couple of years, whether it's as the actual showrunner or a more distant executive producer type, whatever, we don't quite know how that's going to involve, but one of those things is to really make sure that you're engaging with that young audience and bringing the next generation of kids into the show. Are the Slovene a really obvious way to take a leaf out of the Sarah Jane Adventures and bring them in and go, hey, let's get the 6 to 10-year-olds watching so that they're watching in 5 years' time as teenagers?
Oh, it is. It is without doubt. Everything you're saying there is perfectly true. But I come from the school of thought that you scare the bejesus out of kids. And that's what I'd like to do. So it's still for 6 to 10-year-olds. It's just scary as hell.
No, fair enough. So my second pick in this category is the Vardens, who are probably renowned in Doctor Who as the worst realised special effect, the famous tinfoil monsters.
Yeah.
And look, it is terrible. On the DVD, they do make them a little bit better in that they're sort of a CGI blur. There's nothing particularly special about that effect either, but you're talking about a society that, A, successfully invaded Gallifrey. Just think about that for a moment. They are able to travel along any wavelength, including thought. How do you defend yourself from an alien that can travel along any wavelength, including thought, other than locking yourself in a great big lead-lined office.
Yeah.
What do you do then? So I actually think that they are a concept that is ripe for further exploration. And look, the other one that I've just sort of will make a passing reference to is I'd love to see the Megara again done with cool special effects. I think that would be a really interesting concept.
Very good. I had a special mention that I think I can lever in here, which was the Ice Warriors. And the reason I was bringing them up is, because they've been in Who quite recently, relatively. Just so there could be a scene where there's an X-ray machine or something that shows that inside that armor there's a bloody huge, muscly reptilian thing, not the weird little thing from Cold War. So let the retcons begin. I want to see an Ice Warrior out of their gear, and they're actually just this big, hulking reptile thing, maybe special effects could help with that. So that's how I'm wangling that one in.
Look, I was in my 20s, I reckon, before it really occurred to me that the Ice Warriors were wearing armor. I thought they were just walking around naked and that's what they looked like. and the Ice Lords were a little bit more decent, so they had, overalls and a cloak. But the others were just walking around. I thought that's what an Ice Warrior looks like. So it never occurred to me that was a helmet and armor and everything. It was just a monster.
Yeah. That's quite funny.
Confessions. Stories, prequels, or people?
Ooh, stories.
So these are monsters, and I've got 3 in this category that I want to bring back because of the stories that I would want to tell. Mm-hmm. So I'll mention, I think I'll go through these one at a time. The first one that I have are the Draconians.
Oh, yeah.
Now, I think this is a really obvious one to bring back. The Virgin New Adventures did sort of lean into bringing them back. DWM, I know, has featured them, or at least individuals from the race on occasion. So they have sort of been trying to get back for a while. Mm-hmm. But if you think about what the Draconians were, they were the analogue for the Cold War in space.
Yeah. And
within that, you had a society that had a certain amount of respectable honour, a large amount of misogynistic type honour. So, an interesting blend there. They have a history. They have individuals. So there are characters. They obviously, they looked good in 1973. Yeah. They'd look even better now. So I'm not sort of saying we need to redesign them. The design's pretty good. But you could use them to be, again, that analogue and talk about global politics in the post-Cold War era with the Draconians. And you could have a story that maybe is an analogue of the invasion of Ukraine, for example, or that is, I don't know, something about the war on terror. Are there breakaway Draconians that don't want to live in peace and are doing their own thing? There are stories, if you want to make Doctor Who Hulkian again and political, the Draconians are a way to do it with an awesome monster, or an awesome alien race, I should say, who we know can be well done and effective and look good. So I think I'd love to see the Draconians because of the story we could tell.
Oh, that's marvellous. I will say I've got 2 for this category.
All right, well, let's have you first.
This one might be... maybe it's not similar. I'm going to go with the monks here, Dave.
The Capaldi monks?
Yes.
Oh, good.
And I'm including these guys for a very specific reason. And that's that I think the 3-parter they're in is terrible. Mm-hmm. So why would I want to see them back? Because to this day, I still don't fully understand what they really wanted in that story. It was to conquer the Earth, sure, but why? I still don't get that story. So let's take them, because they look amazing. These corpses in monk robes, they're scary AF. Let's see them in a different adventure where the whole thing isn't solved by, the companion's love for their mother, whatever it was with Bill. Oh my God. Flashbacks. Let's see them behind something. So they could be missing for most of the episode until they're revealed as being behind it all, and they're causing hallucinations in people who are thinking something else is going on. Let's do something with that. Let's take them from a great look, a scary look, to actually doing something that the audience can understand and being something amazing. I'd love to see that. I'd love to see a turnaround with these guys.
Yeah, I think that's a very good call for exactly the reason you've said. Let's explore what I think most fans, certainly people we engage with, at the start of that trilogy have gone, that's a really cool idea. I'm really invested in these guys. And then by
and
the
they
end,
look good.
They look good, exactly. So we're invested in the idea and the look, and got to the end and thought, huh?
What's all that about?
What's all that about? Yeah. So let's explore what that's all about. Good idea.
Yeah, thank you.
My next one I want to bring back for story purposes is the Chelonians.
Yes.
And they are, of course, the giant...
Now, Dave, I should pull you up. Chelonian. We've had a lot of different pronunciations of that on a recent podcast.
We have, and this is going to be an interesting part of the Broad and Deep podcast we mentioned, where we start actually having to say out loud names that we've only ever said in our heads. I've always said it in my head with a soft sh. Right. Others say with a hard ch, but I say the Chelonians. These are, for those who aren't aware, they are the giant warlike tortoises.
Yes.
that went on and conquered a large part of the galaxy, but are also very good at flower arranging, as designed by Gareth Roberts in the New Adventures. And look, just from that, why would you not do that? I mean, we now have the technology to do giant walking tortoises. These are an alien race that are hermaphroditic, and there's some interesting stuff you could do with that. But they are just really interesting creations. And how do you not want to see giant tortoises walking around attacking humans? Like, that's just a Doctor Who story that can be both fun and dangerous at the same time. I think we're there. They have been mentioned in the show. They were standing in the background just off camera in one of the Matt Smith episodes, apparently. But right. Yeah, I'd love to see them.
That's interesting. Before we get to mine, I'll say your two choices here are two wildly different things, because the Draconians are so well realised, and like you say, you wouldn't have to change them all that much, because they already look quite good back in the day. Whereas the Chelonians, as I will say it, are sort of an open book. I mean, we know what they've got to be, but they've never sort of had a starring role in the past to really work on. So you've picked two quite different concepts here, I think.
You wait till you hear my third.
Oh, okay. Should I go with my second?
But go with your second first.
I'm going to go here, Dave, with the Sisters of Plenitude. Now, I think the look of the Sisters of Plenitude sold them to me right away. Although...
You're going to have to remind me, Rob.
Yes?
Who are they?
The Sisters of Plenitude are the cat nuns, Dave.
Thank you. You should have said cat nuns. I would have got that.
Okay. I'm going with the cat nuns.
Thank you.
Because although on one hand they're women in makeup, I've always bought into them for some reason. They're absolutely real to me. And I think the whole religious order thing can be really interesting in stories, because it's the kind of environment that has layers. There are leaders, there are followers, there are people who might believe different things to other people in the same order. There's conflict there within the ranks before we even get to what they might be actually doing in the story. And in terms of what they're doing, again, you could have them doing something genuinely good or genuinely bad, depending on your point of view, and it can still fit into what they're doing and why they're doing it. Again, think of real-life religious orders doing things which, in its heart of hearts, it thinks is absolutely right and best and doesn't think it's doing a wrong thing at all. But those things can actually be very harmful, or they can have followers who take their teachings or their position on things and then abuse that. I think there's a lot more that can be done with these crazy cats, shall we say, because of the religious order nature of them.
And I don't know why I think this, but in my mind, they work perfectly with Ncuti Gatwa.
Yeah, okay.
I don't know what it is about how I think of his character, given that he hasn't been Doctor Who for a minute on screen, but there's just something about the emotional depth we've seen him portray as an actor, and the stories you could tell about a bunch of well-meaning but sinister cat nuns that I think I just see working. And I don't know what part of my gut is telling me that, but something deep down is.
Interesting. Yeah, I like that idea, though.
I do too. And I'm just agreeing and nodding with you on that one, I think.
Let's just sit back and nod for a bit. That would make terrible podcast, wouldn't it?
That's right. Look, the third one I had in my story category could have potentially been in my special effects category, but I left it here because the first and foremost reason why I've put them in is because of the story I want to tell or see, and that is the Crotons.
Great, yep.
Now, I think the Crotons are actually a fairly cool design, badly realised. I think the shape of the Crotons and the sound of the Crotons is really cool. They just obviously made of cardboard and wobble really badly and can't pick up their gun. You know, they're not the best executed of monsters. So there is a way in which you go, look, the special effects would be an improvement there. But we've only again seen a couple of stranded Crotons out there, and this is a fascinating concept, you know, a crystalline-based life form that seems to be quite callous and warlike. Now, what happens when you see 1,000 Crotons? You know, what do the Crotons actually do when they're not just crashed on a planet desperately trying to get away with a really terrible plan that, you know, involves, you know, finding two highbrains by killing the smartest people in the gene pool every year? You know...
Yeah, exactly.
There's a better story to tell with them, and I would like to see that story.
Yeah, good call there. Good call back, too, to the 60s, yeah.
Prequels or people?
Oh, prequels, I think.
Prequels. I've sort of got 2.5 here. How many do you reckon you're going to get in this category?
I can squeeze in 2 short ones.
Well, why don't you go first this time?
Okay. I've jotted down Sutek. A bit of a no-brainer here with such a strong and well-remembered villain, I guess. But to get out there and do something clever with him, perhaps in a prequelish way, perhaps leading up to how he ends up imprisoned, maybe. That's going to be my tie-in that I'm making on the fly here. That's not in my notes at all. He is very big and daunting. Is he too big and daunting for people to tackle? Would he scare the writers to attempt it? Or would someone have the cojones to do a prequel and have him locked up at the end? I don't know.
I came very close to putting Sutek on my list, so I'm glad that you did.
Okay.
And look, I agree with you. I think that the story of Sutek's imprisonment and his defeat by, was it 750 gods or whatever it was? Mm-hmm. Try to do that on a 1970s budget? No.
No.
Doing it now? I can see that. Maybe. And is that a story about just the Doctor being overwhelmed and in the end he's, you know, watching gods fight? I mean, that's a story in itself.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, it'd be awesome, actually.
I've got sort of 2 here because I think they're both the same prequel story and the same reason for putting in. So I'm going to do them together, and they are the Exelons and the Exarians from Death to the Daleks and from Colony in Space. Now, in both of these stories, we have a civilization that has collapsed and descended into barbarism and primitivism. Mm-hmm. What we haven't seen is the story of those societies at their peak and how they descended into barbarism and into primitivism. How did the Exelons go from creating this incredible, powerful living city to wearing sheets and chanting at a god? How did the Exurians go from creating the ultimate doomsday weapon and being one of the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy to being the primitives that are living on Exarius by the time the Doctor arrives? I think that, you know, you wouldn't do both, you do one or the other, and they are very similar stories. I think, again, in an age where Doctor Who likes to lean into allegory and politics and warnings about the future, there is a way to tell either of those stories that doesn't have to be preachy but can have a message. I mean, the story about a civilization that creates the ultimate weapon and that is the start of their downfall is a story that would have a message and a moral and a meaning if done correctly. The story of the Exelons where their hubris leads to their defeat, I think would be fascinating, and they're both just such interesting stories from the Pertwee era. I'd like to see them before we met them. Yeah.
My question is, how much would you lean into sort of telling the audience, oh yeah, this is something from the Doctor's past and all that sort of stuff, or would it be more sort of airy-fairy throughout the story and then the penny drops at the end that was those guys?
I think with the Exurians, you could really have the penny drop right at the end because there'd be not necessarily any way to sort of signal to the audience or to fans or to the Doctor even that this is actually the same planet that he's visited. And, you know, you wouldn't necessarily draw them together. I think with the Exelons, though, you kind of would have to have the story of the Doctor warning what's going to come and presumably failing, because you have to see the city being built.
Yeah, true.
So that sort of, and maybe if you're doing a two-parter, the cliffhanger is the, Doctor comes over the horizon to see this magnificent city, and oh my God, I recognise that. It's the city of the Exelons. As the beacon's being turned on or something. That would be, I think, a really strong moment. And then it's like, how do we try and shut this down before it wipes out most of the civilization and get away? I think they're two different tales in that sense.
So you could tell it as two different tales. You wouldn't have to have one or the other.
You're right, actually. Yeah, you're right.
My other one that I'm going to try and just sort of lever in here are the Sontarans. And I know they've been brought back recently and brought back pretty well, but I always wanted something to replace the comedy Strax Sontaran, so I'm kind of happy with how they were brought back. But I think we need something new in a Sontaran story, and perhaps doing a Genesis of the Sontarans type story could be very cool and warranted. I think they're a big enough monster that we could have that.
It's been floated around since at least the 80s, this idea of a Genesis of the Sontaran story.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I think it kind of leans into what I was talking about before. How do you get a society that becomes so fixated on war that they give up their Sontaranicity to become just a clone race that exists simply for warfare and actually just lose everything that you've been fighting for?
Well, maybe for most of the story, they are a very mixed society and very vivid and broad, and they do all sorts of things. But whatever happens in that story, it's the final beat of the story. You see how they're going to go down that path. Maybe you don't see them go down it, but you just see that they're going to go down it.
Can we bring the Rootans in?
I think that would be okay.
Good. I want to see a Rootan.
As the trigger, maybe?
Yeah, I'd love to see a Rootan in New Who. I think that would be awesome. A couple of just little ones that I had mentioned here as well. I would love to see the Kralls before the android invasion.
Yeah.
See them at the height of their powers. And again, it's the really cool design that I think done with 2020's prosthetics would be really interesting.
Another one that looked good in the 70s.
It looked good in the 70s, but it was clearly a rubber mask.
Yeah.
Just look like the same look, but just with better tech, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And you mentioned Gabriel Wolf's Sutek. I want his other character back with a prequel.
What, Satan?
Yes, Satan. The beast from the Impossible Planet. That is a favourite story, I think, both of us. Somehow you get this incredible power that is trapped on a planet balanced around a black hole with its soul in a jar. I want to hear that story.
Yeah. Yeah, how did that happen?
And I just want Gabriel Wolf to turn up and voice it. That's all I ask.
It's very similar to the Sutek story, though, in a lot of ways.
It kind of is. I think in both cases you've got to find a way to get this incredibly powerful being captured. That could either be really, really awesome or really, really terrible.
Yeah, it can't be the companion loving someone. It cannot be.
Oh, let's hope not. We're on to people.
Yeah.
Now, I've got 4 that I can mention to a little degree here. How many have you got, Rob?
I've got 2 biggish ones.
2 biggish ones. Well, look, I'll open then.
Okay.
The first I've got is someone I would love to see back because he's such a fun character, because of the promise of the character. That is Count Grendel of Gracht.
Nice.
Anybody who ends the Ep story with saying, "Next time, Doctor, I shall not be so lenient," and diving off into a castle moat is just ripe to be brought back. I think that would be a lot of fun.
That would be massively fun. Agree.
What's one of yours?
Dave, I'll just pull out the big one now. I'll pull the rubber band. I'll pull the Band-Aid off. I'm going with the Celestial Toymaker. Okay. And yes, we're in for two territory here with Russell T Davies not just tweeting a pic, but us knowing that Neil Patrick Harris is on set, there's a toy store, and he probably is the toy maker again. So, Rob, you're so edgy, picking things that are already happening. But no, seriously, this goes back decades. Before my previous example of reading an NSA, we need to go back to 1987 here, where I'm a complete mad ferret in my first rush of fandom and all that stuff, and I read the Target novel of the Celestial Toymaker, and I thought it was brilliant. And as my fandom went on, and I put together that in the Doctor Who universe there are Immortals, there are Eternals, I mean, just watch Enlightenment. It would make me think about how cool these characters are. They're gods, basically, and they're bored. They're like Q on Star Trek, you know?
Yeah.
And just like the Eternals would race their ships and the Toymaker would play games, it just seemed a no-brainer to me that you'd have the character back. And of course, there was the whole Nightmare Fair thing, which had happened or not happened, as the case was, just a couple of years earlier to that. So this character coming back has always been in the sort of back of my head to some degree. And now it's actually happening, or seems to be happening. I think it's amazing. But even if that wasn't happening today on the streets of the UK, I would still put the Celestial Toymaker in this list.
The Celestial Toymaker was, for me, as a kid, a story I really latched onto because the imagery was so powerful, but also that sort of imagination of a world created by an immortal being who sets up rules just because he wants to. He doesn't have to, have a rule where his world's destroyed when he loses a game. That's just the rule he set up to keep his life interesting.
Yeah.
And this idea that if you lose the game, you become a playing card or a doll, and you're now sort of trapped in his world. There's so much there that's really sinister and creepy. Fortunately, Michael Goff has passed away, so he would not be playing it, given his slightly problematic character. If you want to know more about that, Google Michael Goff, Annika Wills, domestic violence, and you can learn the rest for yourself. But no, I think that's a really good call.
Oh, thank you very much.
My next one is Morgana Le Fay.
Oh, great, yeah.
One of the, I think, outstanding villains of the McCoy era, played wonderfully by Jean Marsh, and just that real sense of a character with its own sense of morality and honour and motivation that is interacting with ours, powerful in terms of the witch-like effects and abilities that she has, but defeatable because of the humanity within her. I think there's a really good story to tell. Now, do you do a sequel to Battlefield? Do you do a prequel to Battlefield? I'm open to either, but I think that she's a character that I would like to see back.
I would do the prequel so you could sort of understand their relationship a little better.
And see the Doctor as...
Merlin. Yeah.
I might do another one since I've got a couple more from you.
That's a good idea because my one is very similar to the one you just did.
Excellent. Well, I'll carry on. Magnus Greel.
Great.
The Butcher of Brisbane. Let's do a story. Let's set it in Brisbane. And let's...
Brisvegas.
Yep. The most remote place in the universe, according to Tegan. And, she's not entirely correct because Perth exists, but she's pretty close. This idea of going into the sort of, World War VI, the year 4000, time agents, experiments, oppression, nastiness, and just a terrible, sinister villain, I think is a really obvious thing to do. For those who are a little bit concerned about his association with the talons of Wen Chiang, well, it would have no association with China or anything like that. This is him in Brisbane in the year 4000. I just think that he's a really evil, mad scientist. I'd like to see more of him.
Yeah, good call there.
Your big one, Rob.
My big one, which is very similar to your Morgana one, basically, is the Rani. And I think this has been a no-brainer for the longest time. In an era where the constant cry is, we need more female representation, to the degree that we made the Master and then the Doctor a woman, we have had this brilliant female character sitting on the sidelines literally for decades, going to waste. I don't get that at all, Dave. Did Pip and Jane Baker want too much money for her to be used? Did they just block her from being used? I can't see any good reason to have this complex Time Lord character, a real match for the Doctor, and someone who you can portray as not so much evil, but just amoral. And that's a really fascinating sort of thing, and being a Time Lord, you can have different versions of her. You can do the whole let's match what the current Doctor is like thing, or you could throw that out the window, and if Ncuti is going to play it as this really young guy, you could have someone really matronly as the Rani who just schools him for most of a story before he comes through in the end. There are so many possibilities with the Rani, and again, I go back to that sort of amoral attitude that she has. I think that's a really rare thing that we don't get a lot of in Doctor Who, actually. People are always made out to be really, really evil.
I'm going to commit heresy here and
Here we go.
say that for me, the promise of the Rani has always been stronger than the realization of the Rani. I actually don't think Mark of the Rani is a particularly good story. I certainly don't think Time of the Rani is a particularly good story. And I think that for all the promise that you've talked about, that premise that you've talked about, Rob, it doesn't really come across on screen in any meaningful way. There's a couple of nice moments. Her turning people into trees is kind of cool, but why? But don't get me wrong. If you can take the premise and do it right, as you say, the series is crying out for a strong female villain.
Yes, this is what people want.
Yeah,
Why aren't we doing it?
I get it. I absolutely get it.
Yeah, it's amazing. We sort of dance around it and invent other things to fill the void when this character already exists. And the first two stories might be a bit duff, Dave, but this is the opportunity to do the character right, because the building blocks are all correct and everything that people want today. It's a no-brainer.
Look, if I'm bringing back the Crotons on the promise they're going to be better, you can certainly bring back the Rani. Thank you very much. That's only very fair. Look, someone who just came into my mind then when you're talking about the desire for strong female villains is Cesare of Diplos.
Yes.
This master criminal, I think, would be a really interesting character to bring back. So I'll have her. But look, my final one is a new series reference. Rob, you picked this a month ago. I want to see Adam brought back. This guy was brought into the TARDIS to be a companion. He, for avaricious reasons, for pure greed, he messed that opportunity up. He was then abandoned by the Doctor with a hole in his head in the year 2020 or something. Let's see the next part of that story.
How bummed were you when I picked that a month ago?
So annoyed. I almost dropped him off the list just so you couldn't have the I told you so moment. But I popped it in there right at the end. Look, I do genuinely think that Adam is one of the standout reasons why I like that first series. I think that idea of first of all, a male companion done really quite well, but again, a companion who messes up the opportunity, I think is really interesting. And the way the Doctor abandons him just sets up the next part of that. Yeah, I just think that's a no-brainer for me.
Yeah, might have to be played by a different actor.
Yeah, the actor's got issues, hasn't he?
Yes.
I don't really remember the details. I just know I've read that, he's persona non grata now for what I believe are valid reasons without remembering the specifics. So, yeah, well, again, I imagine if you want Google, we'll answer those questions.
Yes, it will.
Did you have any, Rob, that haven't fallen into my categories?
No, I managed to get them all out.
Nicely done.
Thank you very much.
We have covered over 20 different baddies in that list.
Yes, we said this wouldn't be like a Little List Makers episode, and we've delivered.
No, absolutely. And look, it has, for me, and I think what was the intent when we were thrashing this out, it has really highlighted a number of ways you can do this and a number of ways you can bring villains back for reasons that are beyond just let's bring them back or let's see them done with new special effects. There are stories linked to most of these that I think is more what I want to see than the baddie itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And, getting into some of those planets or prequel ideas, I think is a big part of that, because sometimes these baddies come from a bigger culture that might be doing other interesting things, or you might see why they turned out the way they turned out, or gosh, we could sit here all night sort of hashing out story ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can do a story about the Draconians without the audience requiring any knowledge whatsoever of frontier in space.
Oh, hell no. That's it.
But it would, of course, be a bonus to those of us who have been watching the show for a long time.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's the beauty of this kind of stuff. It suits everybody.
It does. But, I mean, I think we're very aware this is a very large fantasy on all our parts.
Yeah, absolutely.
But fantasy's fun.
It is. It really is.